the unemployed and people who are still seeking work, and also those who are not seeking work, tend to have disproportionately higher support for the ANC. That's kind of counterintuitive if you think about it, because we think that people who have been marginalized in the labor force, they have very little hope, very little opportunity.
Hello, my name is Donald. I'm filling in for Beatrice, who's currently playing hide and seek and waiting for me to find him. This is WorldView, where we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. Today we're talking with David Ansara. David is the Chief Operating Officer of the Center for Risk Analysis. In this role, David manages the CRA's Policy Research and Political Risk Advisory Services. He is also responsible for the CRA's Bespoke Projects Division. David, welcome to the show.
Donald, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Great. So David, like I told you just before we started it, I absolutely love your channel. And one video I really like to focus on is where you did an analysis on some recent election polling results. Can you give us an overview of what happened there?
All right, Donald. Well, I have got some data in front of me, which I think will help us to ground the conversation. And I think it's just really useful to look back on the last national and provincial elections in 2019. This is essentially a picture of the electoral map that you're seeing here. So what you see with the dark green, that's strong ANC support, so more than majority support. Light green is less than a majority. Less than an outright majority. And then the blue is the DA, and the red's not actually the EFF, but that's the IFP, which is very much centered in KwaZulu-Natal. And I think what's useful to note is that we have access to some polling data, which we provide to our clients. So the Center for Risk Analysis, we don't only do YouTube videos, we're also a policy think tank and an advisory unit that helps corporates and also increasingly individuals to understand the risks in South Africa and to help them navigate through some of the very tumultuous and uncertain times that we find ourselves in. So we actually have conducted extensive polling, and what you see here is really a breakdown of the ANC's electoral support in terms of various demographics. So, the way polling works is you'll have a demographically representative sample that's geographically dispersed across different age ranges, economic income brackets, and then also geographies. And I think what is quite startling with some of this data, and I mentioned this in that video that you were referring to, is that ANC support is based on a few key demographic groups, if you will. So not necessarily racial groups, but for example, as this slide shows here, the unemployed and people who are still seeking work, and also those who are not seeking work, tend to have disproportionately higher support for the ANC. That's kind of counterintuitive if you think about it, because we think that people who have been marginalized in the labor force, they have very little hope, very little opportunity.
They are the ones responsible for that.
Yeah, that they would see a kind of a causal link between the people who set policy in Pretoria and the availability or lack thereof of jobs in the jobs market. But, if you also consider that group of people, they tend to not have very much opportunity. They tend to be based in rural areas where the ANC has consolidated its power. It is very much aligned and connected to traditional leaders as well. At the provincial level also, the ANC has been able to dispense patronage to essentially buy loyalty from kind of local groups, traditional leaders being one of them, but also kind of local political barons. So, also this group of people is dependent on the state for welfare. So we have another graph, which I haven't prepared here, but which shows the number of jobs since about 2008, and it's kind of flatlining like this. And the number of income grants, that's now up to about 18 million. Number of people with jobs is about 16 million. It's been hovering around there for the last 10 years or so. It hasn't really grown much, but the population has grown, and the number of income grants that are dispersed on an annual basis has grown to about 18 million. Some people get multiple income grants, but essentially got more people receiving grants than you have in work. And that has huge social ramifications in terms of it means that you're now dependent on the state to maintain yourself, to provide for the basic needs of yourself and your family. And it also means you're going to be a bit reluctant to vote against the political leaders who occupied the state.
Just for interest's sake, sorry,
yeah.
Is there any other poll to compare this with? Like, for example, in 2019, 2018, like, did these numbers go up? For example, the unemployed still supporting the ANC?
We don't have that shown here, but maybe we should take a step back and just look at the overall electoral performance. So what I've shown here is the national election plus polling that was done by Ipsos, which is a very well-known, credible polling company, and then also some of the polling numbers that we have access to. And okay, so here we have the ANC's final tally of the votes, 57.5%. The Ipsos polling in November of that same year, 2019, showed a slight reduction in the ANC's majority. But come September 2020, after the full impact of the lockdown had been felt, you now see the ANC hovering very closely around that 50% mark. Compare that to the DA here in gray and the EFF in red. So our polling suggests pretty similar outcome to where the Ipsos polling was projecting the ANC. So remember, polling is also not a prediction of what the votes will be. It's a snapshot of a moment in time. So you should not necessarily project outwards. But, we've been doing this a long time, and this is the lowest that we've ever seen ANC support registering, both in the actual elections and in the polls. I mean, bear in mind that back in 2004, when Thabo Mbeki was at the height of his power, the ANC got nearly 70% of the vote. And at that time, the ANC was benefiting from the dividends of much more sensible economic policy. So for several years between about 2005 and 2007, we recorded GDP growth rates of north of 5% on average. We actually had a fiscal surplus. So that's the difference between government expenditure and revenue. And the government was actually collecting more than it was spending, which by contrast to today, it just seems like another planet. Today, we're spending about 14% more. That was at least in 2020. We've now had some increases in revenue because of the global commodities boom and the mining sector. They've been able to take advantage of that. So we're collecting more revenues, but still our deficit is hanging around 10%. And that's really not a sustainable position to be in. And when that commodity cycle turns, now we're going to be in quite a lot of trouble. And there's talk of a universal basic income grant being implemented as well, which would do much more harm to the tax base and which would put additional pressure on taxpayers as well. So this, I think, is a good comparison. And you could just, I think you don't necessarily need to be a political scientist or a policy analyst to see the trajectory that the ANC is on. Also, something to bear in mind is that electoral data that the IEC releases shows that the number of people who are voting is also declining. The proportion of eligible voters has declined.
And that mainly affects the ANC, if I'm not mistaken, negatively.
Yeah, I mean, particularly at the local government elections, the opposition tends to benefit from what they call the differential turnout. People seem to be more likely to support the particular local candidate who might be from an opposition party than they would the national candidates. So that has impacted the ANC, but I mean, in some ways, also it's artificially inflated their support, because even though fewer people on aggregate are voting for the party, they still maintain the majority.
Okay, well, so what can we do about this? If we want to now get these people, I mean, obviously the answer is probably economic growth or some sort of availability to internet. What do you think is the solution to get the unemployed to stop voting for the ANC?
I'll answer that question in just a moment, but I just wanted to take a step back to the voter turnout. All right, so basically, over a third of eligible voters, so 34%, stayed away from the voting station completely. So, for all of the ANC's, language around that we represent the will of the people and being a vanguard of the movement, the people's movement, this was the lowest voter haul on the lowest percentage poll against the highest non-registration of eligible voters in 25 years. So they received 234 seats out of the 400 seats in the National Assembly and Parliament. But in reality, only about 26.5% of all voting age South Africans had actually turned out to vote for the ANC, if you do the calculations.
Wow.
That also shows some level of disaffection with the parliamentary process, I think, that people are, they're not feeling like the ANC is representing the interests, but they haven't quite brought themselves to vote for the opposition. And so it's almost like a tacit or passive rejection of the ANC without necessarily voting against them. But in our analysis, people often say, well, why is ANC support so sticky? And our view is that people respond to improvements in their material circumstances. That's why ANC support went up to that near 70% point in 2004. Life was getting better for many people because of improvements in governance and service delivery and so on, and growth in GDP per capita. People were getting richer, essentially. But the last 10 years has been a period of stagnation, and the ANC support has declined because of that. And the current trajectory is looking pretty negative in terms of the economics of the country. So if you extend that out into the politics, you can safely say that the ANC is heading towards some kind of electoral defeat. Whether that's in 2024 or in 2029, I think is still an open question. But the party itself is also riven with internal factional infighting and division, and the government itself is running out of money, and nothing sharpens the mind more than running out of money.
On that note, sorry. So a lot of people say the local elections are not that important, but I mean, if the ANC loses council seats, don't they also lose access to some patronage jobs and some funding? And that can also help to lead to their demise.
Yeah, so unfortunately, municipalities have been the sites of looting and misgovernance, and many of them have completely collapsed. Basic services are no longer functioning, electricity distribution, water reticulation. In many instances, local community groups have had to take over the running of these facilities just to ensure that the lights stay on and that the taps don't run dry. They are hugely important, and that's really the coalface of service delivery. That's where most people interact with the state, is at the local government level. I think that the stakes are very high, and today, as we're recording, the Constitutional Court is hearing the IEC's submission. Advocate Wim Trengrove is representing the IEC, and he was arguing that, look, the conditions in the country with the coronavirus are just too uncertain at the moment, that Constitution makes provision for freedom and fairness and regularity. His argument on behalf of the IEC is that the regularity point can be pushed out But other parties are saying, like the DA is saying, well, no, the Constitution is very clear. You have to have that election within 90 days of the 5-year term expiring. That would be 1st of November. So they are arguing that the minister, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, when she declared and proclaimed the election date of 27th October, that is binding and that the election must go ahead. So probably by the time this video releases, we'll have a bit more clarity on where the court is leaning. I'm not sure if the judgment will be available then.
Yeah,
but
it's the
stakes are very high.
Yeah, it's a strange concept to me to postpone the elections because, we could be in a fourth wave when the next election arrives, the postponement date. So, you could postpone that date indefinitely. It's sort of it's a slippery slope, that argument.
Yeah, I think the best way to square the circle would be to initiate the elections, but to have them in a phased or a staggered way.
Yeah.
So Advocate Mark Oppenheimer, his argument for the Institute of Race Relations, which is an amicus in this matter, he's going to argue, well, the IEC is trying to kill 9 birds with one stone, is then run 9 elections across 9 provinces simultaneously. He's saying, well, you can kill 9 birds with 9 stones. Why don't you have a staggered rollout? And we've seen that the virus peaks and dips in different provinces on different cycles. So you could have, for example, like in July, there was massive wave of the Delta variant in Gauteng. You could have said, okay, well, we're going to pause the election in this province, but maybe in Limpopo, the virus is not as bad, or in the Northern Cape, now it's suddenly peaking, so let's pause there. So you don't then have to hold up the whole process. And your argument is absolutely spot on. If we find ourselves in February of 2022, and now there's a peak somewhere in the country, then that gives the IEC more justification to delay, and we could have a protracted ongoing delay. And then that's a big concern. We really need, given the misgovernance that's occurred in the local government sphere, we really need more accountability. We need to hold our elected officials to account, and we can't just give them a blank check to rule indefinitely.
Why do you think the IEC is making this argument? Do you think there might be some collusion there, or is it even possible that there might be some collusion there?
Look, I think there's, I don't think there's any evidence for collusion. Obviously, it does suit the ANC to delay because the worst effects of the lockdown are still being felt. There were the July riots, which the government mishandled. So I think it would be in their interest to see a delay, and I think that is what the ANC as a party is arguing for today as we record. But I think also.
Okay, so what do we do now? How do we get the unemployed to stop voting for the ANC? Economic growth, broad internet access. What is your opinion on that?
Okay, so there's that unemployed group as well, and that's a significant group of people. If you look at the economically active populations, about 23 million people who are actively looking for work. 16 million of them do have jobs, but the difference, that 7-8 million or so, they are essentially locked out. And I think that it's quite a difficult question to answer, but I think it's also worth looking at the age profile of the electorate. Typically the ANC's support also tracks the age demographics quite closely. So I don't have the data here in front of me, but about 54% of the ANC's electoral support, or beg your pardon, of those aged 50 and above, 54% of that group tend to vote for the ANC. When you look at the younger age groups below 50 years old, on average, they're slightly less than 50%. So if you had to take out anybody aged 50 and above and remove them from the voters roll, the remainder probably would not vote for the ANC. So that is a headwind for the ANC, that as that older cohort of voters reaches mortality age, their support is going to now come under strain. So that is a headwind for the party, and particularly those young people who are entering the job market. You know, they may be initially filled with hope and aspirations, but as they get into their 20s, I remember when the National Development Plan was put forward by Trevor Manuel back in the mid-2000s. He cited a very interesting statistic, which is that essentially if you are unable to get a job within 7 years of matriculating, basically your chances of being employed go to about zero.
Wow.
So you have to get your foot on the ladder of the job market. And if you don't, then you're going to be locked out. So, I think if I were an ANC strategist, I would not be complacent that support from the unemployed or the poor or rural constituencies, that's going to be unconditional and that's going to last forever. I think the party would be much better served by saying we're going to implement growth-enhancing reforms that are going to encourage business to hire. The state can only hire so many people as bureaucrats or civil servants. And currently, business owners are disincentivized from hiring. There's a whole myriad of policies and regulations, the Labor Relations Act, the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, the National Minimum Wage Act, which sets pricing at a certain level. All of these act as a handbrake on business activity. Just means that you're taking a much greater risk when you hire somebody. And so you don't see all of the jobs that employers didn't even put onto the market or didn't advertise because there's an opportunity cost. They just think it's not worth it. Instead of hiring 50 people, we'll just get by with 10 people because the risk is too high that there'll be a militant strike or that will be taken to the CCMA if there's some kind of minor dispute. And, some of those protections are important and like health and safety, for example. But if you look at other countries, many of whom also have fairly unskilled populations, like Ethiopia, they've managed to absorb millions and millions of people in low value adding manufacturing activities, plugging into global supply chains and making shoes or, clothing or other manufactured products. And you've got to set economic policy for the economy that you have rather than the economy that you wish you had. So a lot of the laws that we have now, like you would see those in Scandinavian countries, highly educated populations, very low unemployment to begin with, very generous tax takings that can support the welfare systems. We don't have that. We're a middle income country. And so we're just putting many, many restrictions on our job market. But I think if the ANC had to liberalize, there would be some convulsions, a lot of political pushback from the unions, obviously. But ultimately, people would see that, my prospects are improving. Last year, I didn't have a job. This year, I do. Now, my son or daughter has a job as well. And they'll see those improvements in their circumstances and reward the ANC at the polls for that.
On that
but
note,
at the moment, the ANC is incapable of implementing those reforms. They just do not have the stomach for reform.
I think it was Dr. Frans Cronje who said that the problem with economic growth, and this is what the ANC sees as the problem with economic growth, is once they produce economic growth, people then tend to go towards the Democratic Alliance or the other parties. They see prosperity, and with this new, and they want more. They want more that the DA and these other parties might provide them. So isn't there an argument to make that the ANC doesn't want economic prosperity?
Look, I think there's some validity to that. One of the other headwinds facing the ANC is that when people move to an urban area, then their voting patterns start to change. And so a lot of people have moved to urban areas in an attempt to improve their life circumstances. For many of them, even if they're living in a shack on the outskirts of town, it's better than living in a rural area where there's no opportunity. And so you do also see the data tending in that direction as well.
That's interesting.
So, yeah, and I mean, this was the case in Zimbabwe as well. MDC was where in the urban strongholds, ZANU-PF increasingly became a rural party. And so a lot of the Operation Murambatsvina, which was basically the urban clear out, was designed specifically to target urban opposition voters.
So my next question would be, why has no political party really capitalized on this? Why do you think all the political parties, the opposition, is struggling to really capture these voters that have now turned away?
Look, I mean, I don't actually agree with the underlying assumption. So, I mean, certainly the DA in the last election, they got 20.6%, I think it was. So they went back slightly. But, you know, there has been a fragmentation of the vote. The EFF has also obviously grown to about 10%. So, you know, I think that's the EFF is also, it comes from the same kind of ideological tradition as the ANC, albeit a more radical version. So, you know, if you lump those two together, you're still seeing north of about 67% of electoral support for the ANC aligned parties, if you will. But, you know, I also think that there has been a proliferation of smaller parties that we've seen, smaller opposition parties. And, you know, I think the media does have a role to play in this as well. You know, often you'll see a narrative around, you know, when the latest corruption scandal breaks in the ANC, for example, people say, well, you know, what is to be done here? You know, we couldn't possibly find another party to challenge the ANC, but here you have the DA in the Western Cape running very clean administrations, very efficient, and the media just almost refuses to talk about them. It's like they don't exist. So, and so I think that the traditional media has a lot of the burden of responsibility there for kind of being very dismissive and hostile towards the DA, and I think unwarranted.
Do you think it's because they consider them a liberal party and they generally just have a negative attitude towards liberalism?
I think so. I think there's some of that. I think also the ANC has done very well to position itself as a hegemonic force. And I think that's why people were advocating for Mr. Ramaphosa as, you know, if you consider the Business Day editor, Peter Bruce, you know, he was saying, you know, Ramaphosa is the least worst option within the ANC. And can you consider voting for anybody else in the ANC? But that serves to reinforce and normalize this idea that the ANC, Tina, there is no alternative. But, you know, I think that gave Mr. Ramaphosa a lot of cover. And, you know, today we've seen now expropriation without compensation is being driven through Parliament. There's some kind of roadblocks there around and debate between the EFF and the ANC around this issue of custodial takings. You know, we now have increased talk of national health insurance. There was the riots, obviously, which showed the breakdown in the security services. You know, so in many ways, we have continuity with past ANC policies, but also backsliding on basic things like property rights, the rule of law, and law and order as well. So, you know, I think definitely the Ramaphoria that was put forward in 2017, 2018, I think has been shown to be a bit of an illusion.
Is it though? Well, in terms of the public's perception, doesn't he still enjoy like a 60% approval rating?
Yeah, so I think one of Mr. Ramaphosa's skills as a politician is to be able to distance himself from the shortcomings of his party, even though he will often say, I'm a party man, I put unity of the ANC above anything else.
It's Makashule or it's Bekachele.
Yeah. You know, so I think becomes a lot of the blowback gets absorbed by some of his some of his colleagues in the cabinet, but he seems to always manage to emerge unscathed. I think he's a very cunning political operator. I think he kind of comes across as this kind of genial guy, a consensus seeker. But, I think it's pretty remarkable how much he's been able to evade some of the, if you consider the PPE corruption scandal during his watch. I mean, he gave assurances that this is going to be cleanly administered, and billions were stolen from the public purse. And yet he still manages to be somewhat above the fray. So I think it takes quite a cunning political operator to do that. Many people say, he's playing 4D chess, he's playing the long game. I think he has been able to convince people that that's what he's doing, but I think more like he's more in a reactive short-term mode.
And a general state of South Africa, recently the Cape Independence Advocacy Group released a poll that showed that I think about 56%, 58% of Cape Townians or people in the Western Cape now want a referendum on independence. How do you think this will affect South African politics? Do you think Cape independence is something that can happen?
Well, look, I actually interviewed Phil Craig of the Cape Independence Advocacy Group recently on my other channel, Solutions with David Ansara, and we had a long discussion about it. And I think there is a growing sense that the existing structure of government that administers the country is not working particularly well. I'm a liberal Democrat, and I believe very strongly in the importance of having democratic institutions. But the administrative capacity of the state has really taken a lot of strain and has collapsed in many areas. And you do see a very distinctly different political and ideological orientation in the Western Cape. It's demographically different, culturally distinct as well. And there's a long history of Cape liberalism, which extends all the way back into the 1850s, where you had, for example, the colored franchise, and it was, albeit a qualified franchise. But in 1910, that was kind of dismissed for the sake of creating the Union of South Africa. And, in many ways, the idea of South Africa is a very modern construct. The active union brought together these four distinctly different regions. And, I think we tend to see nation states as being these like very permanent things that are kind of lost in the sands of time. But ultimately, they're the expression of political interests. And I think the Cape independence movement, I think, is very small, but I think it's quite noticeable to see how sentiment has shifted, as you showed in that polling. And, a few years ago, nobody was talking about Cape independence. And now it's according to some of my sources, the topic of polite conversation around dinner tables in Cape Town. Whereas I don't think that was the case even a few years ago. I'm in Johannesburg, and I also studied in Cape Town at the University of Cape Town, and it was a very interesting time there. But I always was struck by how Cape Townians, have a different outlook in terms of the way they think about South Africa, and often they're accused of being very cliquey. So I'm sure this independence movement suits them quite well. But also, I was joking with Phil after the conversation that Cape Townians can barely organize a braai. So I don't know if they'll be able to organize secession.
I can definitely attest to the fact that, I'm staying in Somerset West, close to Cape Town. So I can definitely attest to there's some sort of a different atmosphere in the Western Cape as opposed to the more north, a more liberal attitude. But you were going to say?
Yeah, so look, I think that poll was quite small. They had a sample of about 886, I think it was. But I think nevertheless, and there's a margin of error of around 4%, but still, I think that shows that there is popular support. I mean, I would advocate much more strongly for devolution of power, decentralization. I think that's where a lot of those problems have come from. We have too much concentration of power in Pretoria. So I think giving the provinces and the regions much more autonomy for how they govern their own affairs is really critical. But part of that is also revenue raising ability. You know, they don't have the ability to tax and to differentiate themselves from each other and from Pretoria. So the National Treasury collects about 95% of all of their revenues for the provinces and then distributes it.
Sorry, isn't that politically difficult to achieve, a devolution of powers? Don't you need like quite a majority in parliament? You basically need the ANC to provide that.
Yeah, look, that's absolutely right. And, you know, but it was politically difficult to dismantle apartheid, right? But ultimately, the National Party had to cave into the pressure. So these things are not impossible or insurmountable. But, you know, what I think is very interesting at the moment is that the Cape independence advocacy movement is also putting pressure on the DA. And now you see the DA introducing private members' bills to Parliament, to Parliament to enable them to run provincial referendums. And so we have the Referendums Act, which goes back to the 1980s, which obviously preceded the creation of the 9 provinces that we have. But the Constitution says that premiers of the province can initiate their own referendums. So the Constitution and the legislation are misaligned. So what the DA wants to do is harmonize those two things, and then start to run provincial referendums around policing or economic policy, various kind of issues that they currently don't have control over. They want to say, do you want the province to be in charge of these affairs? And then use that to push for greater autonomy and then head off that threat from the independence movement. So in many ways, I think it is healthy that it creates this pressure for federalism. The DA has always been a proponent of federalism, but it's never really been at the forefront of a lot of their campaigning or their political actions. So now I think this is really concentrating minds, but also interesting to note that the Freedom Front Plus is explicitly putting Cape independence on their electoral agenda. Anybody in the Western Cape who runs under a Freedom Front Plus banner has to commit to a referendum on Cape independence. So I wouldn't be surprised if within the next few years we see that question being put to citizens of the Cape. But the question is, if they do agree to independence, well, you know, what happens then? The central government in Pretoria could just say, well, we don't accept this, the legitimacy of this. So I think interesting to look at different international examples here. So the one was the movement for Scottish independence. They had a referendum in 2014. But the UK government was committed to respecting the outcome of that referendum. That was part of the political agreement that was reached between the Scottish independence movement and the British government. So the Remain or the no vote ultimately won out. But, you know, I think that was a politically legitimate process. But now if you contrast that with Catalonia in Spain, they ran ahead with a referendum without the consent of the Spanish national government.
Wasn't that also illegal?
It was deemed illegal, yeah, the outcome. And then actually many of those Catalonian independence politicians were then imprisoned.
Yeah, I think the leader, he fled the country, I believe.
I think that's right, yeah. You know, so that's not a good outcome. But, you know, it's, you know, all of the nation states that we have, when we look around the world, they were all created by some kind of political agreement. And in many respects, you know, the criticism of African states is that they're the product of colonial borders that were imposed from the Berlin Conference, for example. And if you look at a map of Africa, many, many straight line borders. That's because they were agreed in a faraway land, often defying geography or culture or history and so on. So I think it's also shows you that I think the traditional notion of the state and its role is beginning to change as well. That you could have much more localized forms of governance. What Franz Cronje terms the enclaves emerging, where you have kind of capital and skills and people converging and coming together in a voluntary way and increasingly disassociating themselves from the state and saying, well, we're just going to look after our own affairs. If you consider a country like Switzerland, it's essentially a collection of cantons, of these small autonomous units. And I challenge you and anybody else watching this to tell me who the president of Switzerland is. Very few people know, including myself, because they have a small federal cabinet where they have a rotating.
And that's a great thing, I believe.
Yeah, but it means that politicians have less power and ordinary people have more say over their own affairs.
So I haven't really heard precisely how the Center for Risk Analysis or Franz Cronje or you specifically lay out the Enclave Society scenario. How do you envision such a society? Because I believe that is what the Center for Risk Analysis believes is the most likely scenario for the future, the enclave scenario. So how far will we dissociate ourselves from the state in these enclaves? Will it be, will we stop paying taxes? How will it work?
Look, I think it's very important to also understand that when we talk about scenario planning, which is what we do at the center, we're not necessarily committed to one particular view of the future. We obviously have a view on likelihood, but we tend to encourage our clients to think more broadly, to say, okay, well, given what we know about the current environment and the trends that we're observing and the data that we're observing, what are the likely futures? So I do think that we are approaching some kind of paradigm shift. And our incoming director, John Indres, he and I had a video earlier this week talking about punctuated equilibrium, which is that things remain static. There's a kind of a status quo for a long time. And then something, often some kind of dramatic political or economic force, creates a change in the circumstances. And that brings about a new paradigm. And we've seen that throughout South Africa's history. Usually it was because of economics, that there was a big economic shock or a world war. The end of the Cold War, for example, opened up South Africa to negotiate with the ANC, that brought the National Party and the ANC together around the negotiating table. So whether that's another international shock in the financial system, or the government running out of money, or a further breakdown in law and order, like what we saw in July in KZN, but on a bigger scale, that will bring about a new fundamental shift. When that will happen is anybody's guess, but I think you do well to prepare for that. But we're already seeing people starting to, either move offshore or move their money offshore, internationalizing their business operations, trying to de-risk themselves from South Africa, not have too much concentration risk. These would be, things that I think would be very useful in terms of hedging yourself against some of the volatility in South Africa. So I think having this assumption that the ANC will reform, it's just a question of time, and we will return to a period like we did in the mid-2000s where we were on an upward trajectory. I think that is unlikely at this point. I think we need to confront the fact that the ANC is incapable of reform. They cannot introduce the policies that are needed to fundamentally change the economy and to create growth. So they're going to be experiencing those headwinds. And often in our engagements with them, they see the challenge, they see the problems coming, and they know that the problems are the cause of their own policies, or attributed to their own policies. But they can't alter the trajectory because they risk destabilizing the ANC. But yeah, how do enclaves come about? Well, we already have a blueprint for them, the Gulf estates in the Western Cape.
I'm living in one.
Yeah. And, those, if you consider how energy security is becoming increasingly a risk, and, the government was essentially forced into reforming energy supply. And because of the rolling blackouts, now having to decentralize energy production, you can now, it still needs to be, processed through the official legislative channels. You can now generate electricity up to 100 megawatts privately. And, a lot of people were celebrating that reform as, indication of the reformist mindset of the government, but those reforms were forced on the government. So I think that pattern will repeat itself, that things will, continue to break down, and the government will be compelled to concede ground, which I don't think would necessarily be a bad thing. It's just not in the kind of orderly, uniform way that many mainstream analysts assume it will be.
Yeah, sorry, just one correction. I think you said Gulf estate. I live in a security state. I'm not that rich, but
Okay.
This has been a fascinating conversation, David. I see our time is running up, and I don't want to spend more of your valuable time. I want to give you one last opportunity to add, plug, or say anything that you want to.
Well, Donald, yeah, I just wanted to say thank you very much. I think your channel is really growing, and it's good to see voices like yours making themselves heard online, and providing the platforms for speakers to share their ideas, and for us to come up with creative solutions to South Africa's problems. That's the theme of my podcast, Solutions with David Ansara. But also in terms of the Center for Risk Analysis, like I mentioned, we don't only serve big corporates. We have individual subscribers as well. So I'll share a link here, but we have a 30-day free trial. So if you want to join us and sample our reports, get access to our data and our regular webinars as well, then you can do that for free. You can get a sense of what we're all about. But I think, we're at a critical juncture in South Africa's history. It's both uncertain, but also exciting. And we want to help people to make informed choices to preserve their incomes, their security, and their place in South Africa. I don't think, many people, when things get a bit hairy, their thoughts automatically turn to, should I immigrate? But I don't think the world is necessarily going to be a very stable place in the next few years either. And it's rather about preparing yourself and making yourself robust for the challenges and risks that lie ahead, rather than kind of putting your head in the sand and hoping those risks will go away. So I hope we've been able to touch on some of those themes a bit in our conversation today. But if you'd like to have another one, we'd be happy to come on, and myself or my colleagues would be happy to speak again on your channel.
Great, absolutely. I will definitely take you up on that. And yeah, I definitely I look forward to more videos from the Center for Risk Analysis, and I definitely recommend anyone to go check out that channel. It's absolutely amazing content that they deliver on the strategic situation of South Africa. But to our viewers, if you've made it this far, please consider liking this video, sharing it as widely as possible, and subscribing to our channel. My name is Donald, and this has been WorldView.